At first, they didn't get you. They said you were hard to read, too quiet, too still. Your answers were short, your pauses long. You didn't give them what they wanted, predictability. You didn't fit the script, and people don't trust what doesn't play by familiar rules, so they called you confusing. But what they meant was, you didn't explain yourself. And that scared them. You didn't overshare. You didn't laugh when they expected you to. You didn't make yourself smaller just to ease the tension. You sat with it. Let the silence stretch. Let them wonder. Let them fill in the blanks with whatever their insecurity painted. And they hated you for it. They tried to label you overthinker, detached, complicated. Because labels make people feel safe. Boxes give them something to contain you with. But you kept slipping through, not because you tried to be mysterious, but because you never felt the need to be understood. Now, they've stopped trying to figure you out, because when people can't define something, and it doesn't need their definition, they start to fear it. You didn't change. You didn't lash out. You didn't fight. You just kept being what you were. Clear, sharp, unapologetic. And somewhere along the way, confusing turned into dangerous. Not because you threatened them, but because you didn't need them. They thought you were cold, not because you were cruel, but because you didn't need to be warm. You listened without nodding. You watched without blinking. You let them talk and talk and talk until they realized you weren't participating. You were assessing. That's what made them shift. Not a word, not a look. Just that quiet realization that they weren't the ones in control. You were never confused. You were never lost. You were just silent. And silence, when it belongs to someone who sees clearly, becomes a weapon. You didn't correct them. You let them misunderstand. You didn't defend your name. You let them misspell it in rooms you never walked into. Because you weren't trying to win the room, you were watching the exits. Watching who folded first, watching who needed to be noticed the most. They called that cold. You called it clarity. Now they speak carefully around you. Less jokes, more filters. Because they've learned that you don't need to say much to make a point. You don't need to raise your voice to take control. And that silence they once found awkward now feels dangerous, like the pause before something breaks. You don't chase, you don't correct, and that's what scares them most. You could destroy everything they've built about themselves just by not believing it. They told themselves you were complicated because it was easier than admitting you were just clear. Your actions made sense. Your decisions were consistent. You didn't play the social game, and that made you unpredictable to people who only know how to manipulate masks. You didn't talk in circles. They just didn't like where the straight line led. You said less, but everything you said had weight. You didn't fill the silence. They did. With assumptions, with projections, with insecurities. They confused your quiet with mystery, but it was never mystery. It was discipline, because you didn't perform for connection. You didn't self-explain. You didn't soften the edge of your truth to make others comfortable. You simply existed fully without apology. And for people who are used to reading reactions like maps, you were terrain without roads. untouchable, undriven, so they called you confusing, because that's what people call anything they can't use. Now they call you dangerous, because that's what people call anything they can't control. And the truth, you never changed. They just ran out of tricks. You weren't built to be handled. You were built to stand still and make the room adjust. They still smile when they see you, still ask how you've been, still keep the tone light, the words friendly, the energy polite. But underneath it, you can feel it, the shift, the hesitation, like someone stepping carefully across glass they pretend isn't broken. They're not talking to you, they're talking around you. Every sentence designed to feel normal, every gesture forced to feel effortless. But the eyes never lie. And their eyes say it all. They remember how calm you were when they tried to provoke you, how steady you stayed when others cracked, how you left without slamming doors, without leaving notes, without leaving them anyone to blame. You didn't shout, you didn't explain, you just watched, and then you moved. Now that silence lives in the space between you. It bends the air, it shortens their breath, and no matter how hard they try to pretend it's fine, they can't unfeel it, because what happened wasn't loud, but it left an echo, and echoes don't ask for permission to return. They talk more now about boundaries, energy, protecting their peace, but what they really mean is, you stopped letting them define you. And that made you dangerous, not for what you did, but for what you didn't tolerate anymore. They've stopped trying to figure you out. Now they just try not to trigger you. It's not fear in the traditional sense. It's respect built on discomfort, because they know you're not unstable. You're precise, not emotional, but final. And when someone like that goes quiet, no one breathes easy. They remember the way you used to sit through chaos without blinking, the way you watched things fall apart around you and never moved unless it mattered. They remember how they used to call that confusing until they realized it wasn't confusion. It was calculation. You were always 5 steps ahead. You just never said it. You let them underestimate you, let them talk, let them twist the story. And then, when they were certain you were lost, you made your move, not to hurt, to end it. Because you don't strike for attention. You don't burn bridges to make noise. You disappear when the math is done. You erase access like it never existed. Now they move around you like there's a line they can't see, but they feel it. They feel the weight of what wasn't said, the punishment that never arrived but still hovers. And the worst part? You didn't need revenge. You didn't need closure. You just needed out. You never needed to be dangerous. They just needed you to stay manageable. And when you weren't, they called it threat. If you're still watching, they already feel it. Subscribe and don't explain. They used to think you were dramatic for walking away without explanation. Now they replay everything you didn't say, every look you gave that lasted too long, every moment you didn't interrupt, every invitation you didn't answer. Back then they called it passive. Now they know better. Now it feels like a strategy, because you never walked away in confusion. You walked when the cost of staying meant shrinking. You walked without needing to win, without needing witnesses, and that kind of exit stays. It lingers, not because it's loud, but because it was final. They don't know how to approach you anymore. You didn't change your number, you didn't vanish, but you're gone in a way they can't touch, like a door that closes silently and never opens again. You still exist in the same world, just not in their version of it. And here's what they don't say out loud. They miss the version of you that tolerated them, the version that made room, that explained, that forgave. But that version didn't vanish. It evolved. It realized silence was safer than negotiation. So now they circle around you like something they lost but can't admit mattered. They call it mutual. They call it growth. But deep down, they know the truth. You left when you realized nothing was going to change except you, and changing you was never part of the deal. They talk around your name now, like it's bad luck to say it directly. They reference things you did without using your face, because mentioning you out loud invites something into the room they can't control. A memory? Maybe. But more likely, it's the echo of who you became when you stopped trying to be understood. You never slammed the door. You didn't burn bridges. You left like smoke leaves a room, quiet, slow, but impossible to reverse. And what you left behind wasn't silence. It was an imprint, a weight in the air, a warning in their throat. Now they rewrite it all, call it miscommunication, say they wish you had just said something, but they forget. You said plenty, they just weren't listening because they didn't think they had to. Back then, your restraint was taken for hesitation, your peace was mistaken for uncertainty, and your silence interpreted as weakness. But you weren't silent because you didn't know what to say. You were silent because none of it deserved your voice anymore. And when you finally pulled back completely, they realized too late. You weren't confusing. You were finished. Now your distance isn't absence, it's a perimeter, a psychological line no one crosses without consequence. You don't have to raise your voice, you just have to look once. The room adjusts, they feel it in posture, in eye contact, in the way their confidence dies mid-sentence. You don't intimidate, you clarify, and that clarity makes people panic. They thought time would fade it, that the silence would eventually dissolve, that they'd stop flinching at your name. But that's not how presence works. You didn't scream, you didn't threaten, you just stopped explaining. And that absence created a shape around them, a kind of invisible perimeter they still feel, even when you're not in the room. You didn't become dangerous because you changed. You became dangerous because they finally realized you were never playing their game to begin with. They thought you were quiet because you were scared. Now they know it was the silence of someone who had already made their decision. You didn't leave bruises, you left awareness, the kind that creeps in slow and never leaves. Now they second-guess themselves in conversations you're not even part of. They filter their thoughts before speaking because somewhere inside they still imagine your eyes reading through the noise. They call it growth, but it's not. It's fear, not of harm, of recognition, of being seen clearly without the mask, of being remembered not for who they pretended to be, but for who they were when you stopped pretending with them. They try to act like it never happened, laugh like they're free of it. But even the laughter has sharp edges now. Even the silence after is heavier, because you didn't just exit, you removed the option to return, not out of anger, but out of precision. They still don't understand it, but they feel it. And what they feel isn't confusion anymore, it's exposure. They live differently now, talk softer in certain rooms, watch their tone with new people. It's subtle, but it's there, like something in them adjusted after you left. Not because you hurt them, but because you didn't. You didn't react, you didn't chase, you just left them alone with what they really are. And that's what rewired them. You weren't an explosion, you were a mirror. And no one walks away from their reflection unchanged. Now even in new spaces with new faces, they rehearse. They prepare for a version of you that might never return. Not because they expect you to, but because they know that kind of clarity shows up unannounced. Once you've been seen like that, you start building walls you don't tell anyone about. Quiet ones, deep ones. They still don't call it fear. They call it boundaries, energy, being more intentional. But you know the truth. Their change isn't growth, it's residue. A scar shaped like the moment they realized they weren't the ones holding the power. They measure people now, not by how much they say, but how little they need to. They scan for quiet. They study the ones who don't perform, because now they understand danger doesn't always move loud. Sometimes it just sees everything and walks away. And what's worse than being hurt by someone? Being understood by someone who no longer needs you. They don't reach out anymore, not because they've healed, but because they know the silence between you isn't empty. It's loaded, not with anger, with truth. The kind that doesn't ask to be spoken, the kind that just is. You didn't block them, you didn't warn them, you didn't burn the bridge. You just stopped showing up to places where your presence had to be managed. And in doing so, you showed them what real finality looks like. It's not loud, it's not dramatic, it's clean, cold, quiet. They still tell the story their way. Say things like, you changed, you disappeared, you made it complicated. But the people who really know better. You didn't change. You just stopped giving them access to the parts of you they never respected in the first place. And now, you don't speak about it. You don't correct the record, because correction implies care. And you moved beyond that. You're not holding on to anything, not the memory, not the insult, not the version of yourself that needed to be seen. You became the version that sees everything and needs no reaction in return. They called you confusing because they couldn't decode your calm. They called you dangerous when they realized you didn't need decoding. And now, the only thing louder than your silence is the part of them that still hears it.